Before I start with my charts, what you said is for me personally very important. You mentioned that I'm a pioneer. In former times when I was soldier, I was a tank soldier, and tank soldiers never the time want to have to be something to do with pioneers. These are absolutely different cultures, but I forget that time. For example, if you are talking about me as a pioneer, well, as a European coordinator, I think this is a very interesting position. Yeah. At first, it is a non-paid position and is a typical position for a retired Secretary of State. Second, I have only one colleague in the Commission. This is Patrick Borrell, and we are working quite well together. And when we started our job, nobody believed that we were able, as a two-man team, in the European Union with 450 million inhabitants, for example, to be with our project successful. The third point is, if you start a discussion process, also with a small team on the political areas, you can be successful. And the fourth time is, I mentioned it before, I was for around about 10 years the Secretary of State, and before that time I was a member of different governments as a civil servant. In my job as a European coordinator, it's the first time that I have no minister I have to answer his questions. There's no chancellor who is saying, hey, George, you're absolutely crazy. There's no parliament where I have to report about my ideas and to get the allowance, for example, to start the process. I can do it alone. And it's the first time in my life, for example, that I'm absolutely unindependent and quite successful, more as I have been in my former jobs. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, when I want to tell you something about this North Sea Grid initiative, at the first time I will give you some facts about European energy politics. Then nobody in Europe knows that we have a European energy politics, and I'm very sure maybe in 10 years we will have an integrated European energy politics in some fields with more competence to Commission and Parliament, and the member states have to give up their own competition. Why? If you look to the three challenges of European energy politics, at first, competitiveness. This is a key goal of the European Parliament, of the European and the politics of the European Commission. And if you look to UK or to Ireland or Germany or France and elsewhere, the question in energy politics that one key or one target is competitiveness. You only will find it in Europe. You only will find it in Europe. What does it mean, competitiveness? It's absolutely necessary to have in some years an internal market which only should be able to act. This means that we have the necessity of interconnections. It makes no sense, for example, to talk about European electricity and European gas and to have no interconnections and no interconnectors. And very important, a European electricity and gas grid, also as a backbone for a functioning internal market. The other things I forget. Sustainable development, renewable energy, and very interesting interconnections for renewables, as well important as for the questions of an internal market. Energy efficiency based on a directive. Nuclear, from my point of understanding, nobody knows, for example, what will be the European position maybe in 10 years for the nuclear policy, but just in the opposite to Germany or Austria, for example, up to date, for example, the nuclear is one of the key questions also for the European Commission and for the European Parliament if you are talking about producing electricity. But my personal point of or if you will ask me, for example, what will you say in 10 years? I think the future of nuclear, of electricity produced by nuclear power stations will be in future times an economic question. What in 10 years will be the price for electricity based on renewables or based on nuclear? And what is the product at the electricity fair in Leipzig or elsewhere? And then if you have in 10 or 12 years here an answer to this question, for example, then I think a discussion will start, for example, about the cost situation of nuclear, and maybe nuclear will have then the future, or nuclear will have no future in that time. But from my personal point of understanding, what in the moment is happening in Germany has nothing to do with an economic reality. It's a crash process, for example, as an answer on an election, and this has nothing to be with the necessity of a stability framework also for energy politics. When I would be a Secretary of State, for example, I would have some problems with such an idea, for example, but no, I'm absolutely free. Okay, another key point, security of supply. Absolutely important, an international dialogue. But then there's a question, for example, who is the speaker for the Europe of the 27, for example, with the Russians, or with the Ukraine, for example, if you have a new gas problem maybe in January or in February. European stock management, refining capacity and energy storage and so on, and also interconnections also as a backbone of a European security of supply, interconnections for gas and for electricity. This other slide, very short. Here you can see, and nobody is talking about it in the member states, about a dramatic, interesting process in legal policy by the European Commission and by the European Parliament. Who is, for example, in Ireland, talking about the consequences about the second strategic energy review? Or who is talking about the consequences of the third internal energy market package? Here is the director of the Irish Regulation Authority. I'm very sure that you are in 10 years, you will hold your passport as a member of Ireland. But in your position, in 10 years, you will be a member of a European authority. And who is talking about the energy infrastructure package of Mr. Oettinger of December of the last year? What I want to say is that we have a dynamic of progress in European energy politics you will not find in a single member state of the EU. And nobody is talking about this fact that Europe is able to produce energy politics for the welfare of the people and for the security of supply of the 27 member states. And therefore we need an alternative discussion to this process, also to get a better feeling to accept European politics. Because in the result, the winner of this process are the civil society and the European economic. No doubt about that. The outcome of this European policy. The directive on renewable energy, also very important for Ireland. Binding targets to reach 20% based on renewables in 2020. Who in the European Union is discussing about this fact? This fact means, for the consequence for the electricity, that we should have in 2020 electricity based on renewables by 35% in Europe. By 35% in Europe. This is nothing else as a political decision for an industrial revolution. No doubt about that. But it was signed by the heads of the governments and by the Commission, and nobody's talking about that. But this is European law. Or energy marketing directives, unbundling, to create NSCOGI, that the TSOs have an own office for energy, electricity and gas, an own office in Brussels, and that they are working together, for example, to find common solution for an future-orientated grid system. And very, very interesting that we have now a 10 years network development plan for the future-orientated high-voltage grid in Europe, and this plan is not created by the Commission or by a government. This plan is created by the TSOs itself, but based on a starting point by the political decision in Brussels. The recovery plan, round about 1 billion euros for electricity infrastructure, and also I think your TSO, for example, if you look to your future cable situation with UK, for example, you have also grants from this recovery program. This is very important because it's the first time that the European Commission, with by permission also by the European Parliament, put European money in national electricity infrastructure projects. And I'm very sure, for example, and this is a consequence if you understand policy, if a government like the Commission and the Parliament, if they were successful, for example, to start initiatives also based by grants from their own pocket, they will never leave this area. And I'm very sure if you look, for example, to the politics of Mr. Oettinger, that we will find new models, for example, to have the possibility to finance future projects for high voltage grids, also based by European grants. And also the energy infrastructure package, which was based in November last year. It's the first time that the Commission started a process about the necessity of European-orientated electricity and gas grids in Europe. The 20% target, the consequence of the 20% target of the Commission and of the member states was that the member states itself produced own climate action plans. And here on this slide you can see, for example, the renewable shares in 2005 and the power of this process maybe for the next years, also with some economic data and so on. And if you look to this slide, the so-called climate action plans, also the position of Ireland and so on, you can see that Ireland maybe is in the European midfield. But this shows, for example, that Europe tries to organize an European-orientated process on the one side, but also to accept national situations and so on. And this makes no sense, for example, to compare Ireland with Germany, because you have in Ireland up till now no nuclear power stations and so on, and in Germany, for example, they have nuclear power stations, also with consequences to the climate policy and so on. But these climate action plans are very interesting because the national member states, they accept a European framework. And here you can see the first outcome of this national renewable action plans. What does it mean in different fields? It means doubling of today's installed renewable electricity capacity in Europe by 2020 to 450 gigawatt. This is tremendous. 450 gigawatt. And the half of this renewable production related to variable energy sources, and here you can see the capacity of the wind energy. And also here, on the last point, you can see the capacity of offshore wind in the North Sea. If we are lucky, we have 40 gigawatt in 2020. But the challenge is, for example, it's possible to reach 150 gigawatts in 2030. And this is also nothing else as an industrial revolution. And the consequence of all these points are also to have a new outlook to the necessity of the electricity grids. Because if we produced maybe in 2030 100 or 150 gigawatt in the North Sea, it's a question for the customer in Milano, for example, that it works. It's a question of balance power, a question of grids, a question of regulations, and so on. And this shows, for example, that we must have a more European-orientated outlook to this discussion. Here you can also see, as a consequence of the national renewable action plans, the electricity based on variable sources, hydro, wind, biomass, solar, and others. And there you can see, for example, we have in Europe a very interesting discussions about the challenge of photovoltaic. From my personal point, this makes no sense. Here you can see, for example, we have a variation around about 400% until 2020. But at the end, we have a share on 9% if it works. But nobody is able, for example, to talk about the economic questions. What does it mean also for the customer and for the customer maybe in the industry and so on. But it makes more sense, for example, to talk about this 200% in wind, where we have a lot other capacities around about this 450 terawatt hours maybe in 2020. I will leave the chart here, and you can give it also to your guests, no doubt about that. Sure. As I said before, the consequence of all these political targets is the necessity to accept investments in distributions and so on, and also to accept investments in new grids. And NSCOGI, these are this club of the European TSOs. In their 10 years development plan, they were talking about the necessity to build new grids. And today we knew to be successful with our 20% goal and other renewable and climate goals in Europe, that the consequence is that we need maybe until 2020, 2030, round about 40,000 kilometers new high voltage grids. This is tremendous. This is an investment problem. This is a regulation problem. This is a distribution problem, and so on and so on. And why this 42,000 kilometers? These 42,000 kilometers are driven by 3 points. Round about 25,000 kilometers driven by security of supply. If we change our classical electricity production structure to more renewables, and if we want to hold our security of supply, the consequence is more grids. Driven by renewables, round about 20,000 kilometers. If we want to be successful with our 20% goal, the consequence are more grids. And driven by an internal electricity market, round about 30,000 kilometers. If Europe makes a sense, and we are talking about European goals or targets, and if we are talking about security of supply in the electricity area, for example, and if we want to have a fair price for the private and for the industrial customer, driven maybe by the electricity fair, we need new grids, because the grids are the backbone, for example, to bring the product to the customer. And this all together, for example, shows that we need 42,000 new kilometers, maybe 50% long terms, but midterms 44%. And then also a question for the specialists, DC and AC and so on. But this is for our discussion at the moment not so important. Energy infrastructure challenges and drivers. And here on this chart, you can see, for example, why we need more grids on the electricity side and on the gas side. And if you're talking about grids, ladies and gentlemen, then we are talking about also the necessity of investments. And the question is, for example, who should pay this story? We knew, for example, that in our 20% target and some other climate and renewable targets, in the consequence, until 2020, in the whole energy area in the Europe of the 27 member states, we need investments for 1 trillion euros. For 1 trillion euros. No doubt about that. Before, when I saw this word 1 trillion, I never heard it before. But this is tremendous, and nobody is able, for example, to explain to people what does it mean, necessity in our European energy system, an investment situation within 10 years about 1 trillion million euros. It's tremendous. Okay, around about 500 billion in power generation. Also, then around about 350 billion euros for the renewables, wind, and so on. And very important, the investments for transmission and distribution are much higher than the investments in the production area. If you look to the past, for example, maybe for 10 or 5 years ago, nobody in Europe, for example, were talking about the necessity of high voltage grids and more high voltage grids. And now we knew, for example, what does it mean on the investment side of the European politics. And now we knew, for example, we need more investments in transmission and distribution than, for example, in the power generation to be successful with our European renewable politics. Yeah, here on this slide, for example, you can see the necessity of this investments. And here you can see the situation, for example, what is be able financed by the companies, by the TSOs itself, and what is not able to be financed. And here we have an investment leg which is not be able, for example, taken by the TSOs. And that means, for example, that if you are talking about this investment gap, we are forced to find new ideas. And yes, new ideas, for example, in which way Europe can finance their European goals or their European targets. And this has absolutely consequences, for example, that we need, from my point of understanding, also a better way to give the regulators more opportunities, for example, to move to the market and not to move in the framework of a European directive. Because this money couldn't come from the national or from the European budgets. This money must come from the European market. And the European market, the financial market, not the financial market. And the financial market will produce answers to the regulatory system in Europe, and they want to have economic answers and no regulatory answers. This has nothing to do with your excellent job and your colleagues in Europe, for example, because you are based on a European directive and a national directive. But this directive must be changed, for example, to open this directive also for the necessity of the consequence of the financial markets. This is, in my position, one of the key questions, for example. A key question, if we want with our European renewable politics successful in Europe, we must open the European renewable politics for the necessity for financing projects from the international financing market. And we have to open it, and we must not produce more European and national directives, because the directive, a national directive or European directive, is an absolutely wrong answer if we want to look worldwide where is the money, for example, that comes to us, that we were successful in this area. This is one of our key questions. we have. Okay, back to the priorities. You see, when I'm talking here, I'm convinced by my European position. But a European position must also open regional solutions. If we are talking, for example, about the necessity to find a market-orientated idea for an integrated North Sea high voltage grid, also to find a solution for the European politics, then this only could be a solution for the North Sea area and has nothing to do, for example, for other solution we need, maybe, for example, in the Mediterranean area. And here, personally, I feel a changing in the position of the European Commission. They will accept, for example, also regional solutions, which is absolutely necessary. And here you can see, for example, the regional priorities. For example, here's the so-called Southern Gas Corridor. This has one name in the energy process. This is a Nabucco project. Or this here is the North Sea Initiative, and so on. And from my feeling, when I started my job maybe 4 years ago in Brussels, for example, the Commission was not so open, for example, to accept regional projects. They only started processes, for example, top-down politics from Brussels, and the member states has to follow. But if you are looking to electricity or gas, this is a European problem without borders and so on, and therefore we need a better feeling, for example, to find regional solutions. Well, if you are talking about the necessity for investment also in the grid situations, for example, then we, ladies and gentlemen, no doubt about that, we need also proposals for faster and more transparent permitting procedures. What is the problem? We have ambitious targets to 2020. We have also some money from the market and so on for this investments in new grids, but nothing worked because the permitting procedures were too long and too complicated and so on. And therefore we need another also national handling, that the TSOs and elsewhere, for example, were able to be successful to build their new projects faster as before. And this is especially an address to the member states. And if you look to the infrastructure package of Mr. Oettinger, you will find some ideas, for example, in which way we, in future times, we should handle it in a better way. Well, and also we need more intensive discussions about key principles. If you are talking of high voltage grids, as I mentioned it before, we have to see it in a European manner and not in a national manner. But therefore, we need some key points for a regional discussion. In which way, for example, I was 2 years ago, I was ordered by the Commission, for example, to organize a new discussion process for a high voltage project with European interest in Austria. And I was the first man who were talking with the people in this area about the necessity of this 300 kV project with European interest. Nobody talked with the people about that. And that's why we need new ideas and a new structure, for example, in which way we were able to organize a new dialogue with new ideas, for example, with the civil society. And that is very important. One point is, for example, from my personal point of understanding, we need more support, for example, by the parliaments. The parliaments are the representatives of the civil societies in the political area. And the parliaments, they have to take responsibility, for example, also for such projects which are standing in a European idea. And for example, but the parliament cannot decide about a planning process or so on. But the parliament can say, well, this is absolutely necessary, maybe that in such a corridor we need a new high voltage grid. For example, also to organize the security of supply for our people in the next 20 or 30 years. And then the people will accept this. But if they don't hear such a key message from the parliament, for example, then they're asking, for example, there's something to do. Okay, and I think also if you are talking about clear and transparent criteria, we don't need new directives. What we need is a willingness, for example, to participate, communication, and so on. This is important, to invite the people to discuss, to explain the people about the necessity and so on, and to explain the people that renewables are nothing which is coming from the stomach or from the sky, and renewables are nothing else the consequence for hard industrial investments, no doubt about that. And if you're talking with teachers, for example, and about renewables, they have no idea, for example, that there are billions of investments are necessary, billions of investments in power plants, renewable power plants, and new high voltage grids. Okay, the way forward for the infrastructure package of Mr. Oettinger, I think he will produce some ideas for a new and additional financial framework, maybe in the summer or autumn of this year. I remember the slide where I showed you, for example, what is the consequence on the financial area. Also very interesting, what has to be changed in Europe in the planning process in the area. On the one side, we have two interesting European sustainable targets, the renewables itself and the Flora, Fauna, Habitat Directive, for example, with the protection to the areas. And what about the necessity if you have to build a high voltage grid? Passing such a Flora, Fauna, Habitat protected area, and for both directives, the responsibility is lying in Brussels. And my vision is Brussels is not allowed to let the member states alone in this question, for example. Brussels has also maybe to add or to change the Flora, Fauna, Habitat Directive if we want to be successful with our new high voltage grids. Okay, there I will wait and see, for example, what the consequence of such a discussion will be. Now, the last slide, because I was absolutely too long. The North Sea countries offshore grid initiative. In December in Brussels, there was signed a MOU by the European Commission and the 10 North Sea member states, including Norway. And because, no doubt about that, there's at first time no alternative for such a North Sea high voltage grid. But then we have, if we want to have answers in which way, for example, the decision process should be organized, what are the consequences for the money from the financing market, what are the consequences for the regulators if you build maybe a grid between UK, Norway, Denmark, and Germany, and you want to have an investor from who brings the money from the pension fund of Australia. He wants to have one-stop solution on the regulatory area and not four different regulatory solutions and so on. And all these questions must be solved. And that's why in the consequence of this MOU, there are 3 working groups. First working group, grid configuration and integration. Second working group, market and regulatory issues. And third working group, planning and authorization procedures. And they have the job, for example, within the next 1.5 years to present the Commission and the national governments ideas, for example, what has to be done in Europe, for example, that we can open the door for planning and investment in the North Sea, because we need this North Sea grid as a future backbone for the European electricity security of supply. And also NSCOGI, and here ACER, this is a European club of European regulators. they bring their ideas in this process, and here is the so-called Adamowitsch working group. This is a real existing working group in Brussels. We organize for these 3 working groups the technical and legal input. And this is a very interesting process, and if maybe in 2 years, 1.5 years, 2 years, we are finished with this process, and then we have a figure for the future, what has to be done, that Europe is successful with their renewable targets, for example, then I go at home and tell my wife, for example, baby, the job is done. Thank you so much that you listened. And Mr. President, it was too long, but I'm sorry for that. To explain European politics is not so easy.